Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week. If you want to understand where football hooliganism really began, you have to go back to a time when Britain was still finding its feet after the war, when cities were rebuilding, industries were booming, and young working-class lads suddenly had something their fathers never did: money in their pockets and time on their hands. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to buy clothes, enough to go out at weekends, and enough to start shaping identities that had never existed before. That was the beginning of youth culture in Britain, and at the heart of it were the mods. The mods weren't originally about football, not in the way people think about it today, but football quickly became part of their world because it was one of the few places where large groups of young men gathered every Saturday. The mods were about image, about looking sharp, about standing out from the crowd. They wore tailored suits inspired by Italian fashion, thin ties, smart shoes, and button-down shirts that looked nothing like the rough working clothes their fathers wore. Over those suits, they wore long parkas, not as a fashion statement at first, but to protect their clothes while riding scooters through the wet British streets. Looking good mattered because it showed discipline, pride, and belonging. If you were a mod, you didn't leave the house looking scruffy. Your appearance told the world who you were before you even opened your mouth. But identity never exists without opposition, and every group eventually finds its rivals. For the mods, those rivals were the rockers. Where the mods were sharp and stylish, the rockers were rough and rebellious in a different way. They rode heavy motorbikes, wore black leather jackets, heavy boots, and greased their hair into thick quiffs. They listened to rock and roll, lived for speed, and took pride in looking tough, rather than fashionable. The differences between mods and rockers weren't just about clothes or music. They were about class pride, territory, and belonging. Each group saw the other as everything they were not, and when those worlds collided, it rarely ended peacefully. By the early 1960s, tensions between mods and rockers had grown into something that the newspapers couldn't ignore. It wasn't just isolated fights anymore. It was groups traveling together, watching each other, testing each other, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The most famous battles happened in seaside towns, places that had once been quiet holiday destinations, but suddenly became battlegrounds for youth identity. Brighton, Margate, Clacton, and Hastings all saw large-scale disturbances that shocked the public and terrified local authorities. Deck chairs were torn apart and used as weapons. Stones were thrown. Groups chased each other along promenades and into narrow streets. Police struggled to keep control as crowds gathered to watch what looked, to them, like organised chaos. The events of 1964 became especially significant because they showed Britain something it hadn't really seen before. Large groups of young people fighting not as individuals, but as tribes. Newspapers ran headlines that painted mods and rockers as enemies of society, calling them dangerous and uncontrollable. For many older people watching from the outside, this was frightening. But, for the lads involved, it created something else entirely: reputation. Suddenly, being known as part of a group meant something. Being recognized meant respect. And respect, once tasted, became addictive. Football began to slip into this picture naturally. Saturday was football day, and football grounds were one of the few places where thousands of young men could gather with very little supervision. Groups began to form around clubs, around towns, and around neighborhoods. At first, it might have been pushing, shouting, or chasing rivals out of certain sections of the ground. But over time, those moments grew into something more serious. The idea of defending your area, your town, your club, started to take root. Even in these early days, travelling away from home became an important part of identity. Getting on trains together, arriving in rival territory, and making your presence known created a sense of unity that went beyond the match itself. The mods also developed something that would become central to football hooligan culture: the group code. It wasn't written down anywhere, and nobody sat you down to explain it. But you learned it quickly just by being around the right people. You stayed loyal to your mates. You travelled together. You stood your ground when things turned hostile. And most importantly, you protected your reputation. Reputation wasn't about winning every fight. It was about not backing down, about being seen, about showing that you belonged to something bigger than yourself. There were also early signs of territorial battles forming around pubs and city centres. Certain pubs became known as gathering spots, and outsiders entering those spaces did so at their own risk. This pattern would later become one of the defining features of football firm culture, but its roots can be traced back to these early mod years. It was in these environments, train stations, pub corners, terraces, that the idea of organised confrontation began to grow. What made the mod era so important wasn't just the violence itself, but the mindset that developed alongside it. These young men were carving out identities in a rapidly changing Britain. They were reacting to boredom, to limited opportunity, and to the need for belonging. And while the seaside clashes made headlines, the quieter moments, the travelling, the gathering, the shared loyalty, were laying the foundation for everything that followed. By the mid-1960s, the mod era had already left its mark on British youth culture, but change was coming. Fashion began to shift. Music began to evolve. The sharp suit started to disappear, replaced by something tougher, more practical, and more rooted in working-class reality. The next generation wasn't interested in looking elegant. They wanted to look hard. They wanted to look ready. And from that shift, from those same streets and terraces where mods once stood in polished shoes, a new identity began to rise, one that would become even more closely tied to football, even more territorial, and far more feared. They were called Skinheads. Chapter 2. The Skinheads, the terraces turn hard. By the late 1960s, the sharp suits and polished shoes of the mod years were beginning to fade, replaced by something tougher, something more practical, and something far more suited to the working-class streets where most of these lads were growing up. Britain itself was changing. Industries were still running, factories were full, docks were busy, and working-class life demanded hard men. The new look that began to take shape reflected that world perfectly. Hair got shorter, clothes became simpler, boots replaced loafers. The neat elegance of the mods gave way to something far more intimidating. This was the birth of the Skinheads. The original Skinheads were very different from the way many people later described them. In the early days, this culture grew from working-class pride and community identity. It was influenced heavily by Jamaican music and style, especially ska and reggae, which had travelled to Britain with Caribbean immigrants. In many working-class areas, white and black youths mixed in clubs and dance halls, sharing music, fashion, and attitude. But when Saturday came, and the terraces filled with thousands of men, those same young lads who danced together during the week often stood shoulder to shoulder with their own side at the football. Football became central to Skinhead identity in a way that it never fully had for the mods. By the early 1970s, terraces across Britain had changed dramatically. They were louder, rougher, and more territorial. Where once there had been pushing and shouting, now there were organised groups, men standing together in tight packs, watching rival sections carefully, waiting for opportunities to test each other. The terraces weren't just about watching the game anymore. They became battlegrounds for pride, status, and respect. Skinhead groups didn't just fight rockers like the mods had done years earlier. Their real rivals were other skinhead groups tied to rival football clubs. The battleground had shifted from seaside towns to stadiums, city centres, railway stations and pubs. Every town had its own group, and every group believed its territory was worth defending. Football rivalries that had once been about chants and insults began to take on a far more serious edge. By the early 1970s, travelling to away games had become one of the most dangerous parts of the football experience. Groups of skinheads boarded trains together, often already knowing that trouble was likely waiting at the other end. This was the period when the term boot boys began to appear, a name that perfectly captured the aggressive reputation developing around these groups. Heavy boots weren't just practical footwear for factory work, they became symbols of toughness. When fights broke out, those boots made a difference, and rival groups quickly learned to respect anyone willing to stand firm in them. The bootboy era marked the moment when football violence started to feel organised rather than spontaneous. It wasn't always carefully planned, but there was growing awareness that numbers mattered, presence mattered, and reputation mattered most of all. Throughout the early and mid-1970s, certain cities developed reputations for particularly fierce terrace cultures. Places like London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds became known for large, aggressive followings that travelled in numbers and defended their territory with pride. Railway stations became flashpoints. Away days often started long before kick-off, with rival groups attempting to intercept each other before reaching the ground. City centres became hunting grounds, where pubs associated with certain clubs acted as unofficial headquarters. Walking into the wrong pub on the wrong day could mean serious trouble, and word travelled quickly about which places were safe and which ones were not. By the mid-1970s, the scale of violence had grown to the point where police forces across Britain began to take football disorder more seriously. More officers were deployed to major matches. Segregation between home and away supporters started to become more common. But even with these measures, trouble still broke out regularly. Many of the biggest confrontations happened outside the grounds, in places where police presence was weaker and escape routes were easier to find. Train platforms, underpasses, narrow streets, these became familiar settings for running battles that lasted only minutes but left lasting reputations behind. Some of the fiercest rivalries during this period began to take shape between major football cities. Clubs in London fought bitterly among themselves, with territorial pride running deep between neighbourhoods. In the Midlands, Birmingham-based groups developed reputations for their numbers and aggression, while northern clubs like those in Manchester and Leeds gained notoriety for travelling support that refused to back down. The exact details of every fight weren't always recorded, but the reputations built from those encounters became part of football folklore, passed down through stories told in pubs, workplaces and terraces. The terraces themselves became structured environments. Certain sections of the ground became known as strongholds, areas where the hardest supporters gathered. Taking control of an opposing end became a mark of dominance. Losing control meant embarrassment, and embarrassment in this world could damage reputation far more than losing a fight. This idea of reputation, of being known, remembered and respected, became the driving force behind much of the violence that followed. It was also during this era that football hooliganism began to attract national media attention in a serious way. Newspapers started reporting regularly on disturbances, often exaggerating the scale of events, but at the same time giving these groups the publicity they craved. Names of clubs became associated with violence as much as football. Stories of running battles, mass arrests, and damaged property became common reading in weekend papers. For many young lads growing up in working-class areas, this publicity didn't discourage involvement. In many cases, it encouraged it. Being part of something feared by outsiders brought a strange kind of pride. Another important development during this period was the strengthening of the unwritten group code. Loyalty became absolute. If you travelled with your group, You stayed with them no matter what happened. Running away alone was seen as betrayal. Leaving a mate behind was unthinkable. These rules weren't enforced by formal leaders or written agreements. They were enforced by reputation and respect. If you broke the code, word spread quickly, and once your reputation was damaged, it was difficult to repair. Away travel continued to shape the culture more than anything else. Journeys by train became rituals in themselves. Groups gathered early, often filling carriages with noise and tension. Rival fans sometimes boarded the same trains, leading to confrontations that erupted before reaching their destinations. When trains arrived at unfamiliar stations, the tension only increased. Waiting groups from rival towns often stood ready, knowing exactly when their opponents were due to arrive. These encounters became some of the most dangerous moments in football travel, and stories of ambushes and counterattacks became legendary among those involved. As the 1970s progressed, the atmosphere around football hardened even further. Stadium conditions were often poor, with overcrowded terraces, limited facilities, and minimal separation between opposing supporters. In such conditions, it didn't take much to spark trouble. A single thrown object, an insult shouted across a barrier, or a small group pushing forward could trigger chaos. Once fighting started, it spread quickly, carried by the momentum of the crowd. Despite the violence, there was also a strong sense of belonging that kept lads coming back week after week. The group became family. The routine of travelling together, standing together, and facing rivals together created bonds that lasted years. Even those who didn't fight directly still felt part of something larger, something tied to their town, their mates, and their football club. That sense of belonging was powerful, and it explains why so many remained involved despite the risks. By the late 1970s, however, another shift was beginning to appear. The skinhead and bootboy look, once dominant, was starting to change again. Younger lads were experimenting with new styles, influenced by football trips abroad and exposure to continental fashion. Trainers began to replace boots. Sportswear replaced workwear. The terraces were evolving once more, and the next generation was preparing to redefine football culture in ways that nobody fully understood at the time. The groundwork laid by the Skinhead, these were organised groups, often referred to as firms, who travelled specifically to make their presence felt. The focus wasn't just on the match. In many cases, the real purpose of the day happened outside the stadium, in city centres, train stations, and surrounding streets. Rivalries during this period became more intense and more organised than ever before. Long-standing football rivalries grew into full-scale battles between organised groups. Matches involving London clubs often carried huge tension, with rival firms attempting to outnumber and outmaneuver each other. Clashes between supporters of clubs from the Midlands and the North gained reputations that travelled across the country. Certain fixtures became known as high risk long before kick-off, with police forces preparing for trouble days in advance. City centres became some of the most dangerous environments during this era. Rival groups would arrive early, scouting locations, watching movements, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Pubs played a major role, acting as gathering points where numbers could be counted and plans could be discussed. Some pubs became famous within football circles as strongholds, known for their association with particular clubs. Entering one of these pubs as an outsider could trigger immediate confrontation. Railway stations remained major flashpoints, just as they had during the Skinhead years, but the approach had changed. Instead of large mobs marching openly, smaller groups often moved strategically, splitting into units, regrouping at planned locations, and targeting rival supporters at moments when they were least prepared. These tactics made policing far more difficult and allowed confrontations to happen quickly before authorities could respond. Throughout the early and mid-1980s, several incidents captured national attention and shaped public perception of football hooliganism. Some of these incidents involved large-scale pitch invasions and widespread damage to stadium property. Others involved running battles through city streets that lasted hours. The level of organisation seen during this period was something new, something that previous generations had never fully developed. One of the most infamous incidents of the era occurred in 1985 at Kenilworth Road, the home ground of Luton Town. During a match against Millwall, tensions between supporters escalated into one of the most chaotic disturbances English football had ever seen. Large numbers of supporters entered the pitch, property was damaged, and police struggled to regain control. The images from that day were broadcast across the country, reinforcing public fears about the growing problem of football violence. For many supporters, however, the incident became another chapter in the growing legend of terrace culture, a story repeated countless times in pubs and workplaces. European away trips also became defining experiences during the casual years. Travelling abroad carried its own risks and rewards. Foreign police forces often responded aggressively to English supporters, sometimes escalating situations that might otherwise have remained contained. Rival supporters from other countries began to develop their own reputations, and clashes between English groups and continental fans became increasingly common. These encounters added an international dimension to football violence, spreading the reputation of English supporters far beyond Britain's borders. Another important aspect of the casual era was the rise of intelligence-led policing. Authorities began collecting information on known troublemakers, tracking movements, and deploying officers in more strategic ways. Surveillance increased. Arrests became more targeted. Some supporters found themselves banned from grounds, marking the beginning of a new phase in football policing. Despite these measures, confrontations continued, often shifting away from stadiums into surrounding areas where police presence was thinner. Clothing remained central to identity throughout this period. Designer labels became badges of honor, signaling experience, wealth, and status within the group. Wearing certain brands indicated that you traveled, that you had connections, and that you belonged to the inner circle. But clothing also became practical, allowing supporters to move quickly and comfortably during long days of travel and confrontation. Trainers replaced boots, not just for style, but for speed. The casual era also saw the strengthening of leadership structures within certain groups. While not always formal, influential figures began to emerge, individuals known for their experience, confidence, and ability to organize others. These figures helped coordinate travel, manage numbers, and maintain discipline within the group. Their reputations often became legendary within football circles, and stories about their actions spread quickly among rival supporters. Away days during this period became highly ritualized events. Early morning gatherings, train journeys filled with tension, arrival in unfamiliar territory, and the constant awareness of rival presence became routine. The journey itself became as important as the match. Every stage carried the possibility of confrontation, and every successful encounter added to a group's reputation. Stories from these trips were retold repeatedly, growing larger with each telling. By the mid to late 1980s, football hooliganism had reached its peak in terms of organisation and national attention. The media covered incidents extensively, often portraying supporters as uncontrollable mobs, while government authorities pushed for stricter regulations and harsher penalties. The introduction of new security measures inside stadiums began to change the environment once again. Segregation became stricter. Barriers were reinforced. Police presence increased significantly. Despite these changes, the culture that had developed over decades did not disappear overnight. The bonds formed between supporters remained strong, and the traditions built during the casual years continued to influence football culture long after the peak of violence had passed. Even as stadiums modernized and regulations tightened, the stories from this era lived on, carried by those who had experienced it firsthand. By the end of the 1980s, it was clear that football culture had gone through a dramatic transformation. From the sharp suits of the mods, to the heavy boots of the skinheads, and finally, to the designer sportswear of the casuals, each generation had left its mark. But, beneath the changing styles and tactics, one thing had remained constant: the code. The unwritten rules that governed behavior, loyalty, and reputation had survived every shift in fashion and every change in policing. And it was that code, more than anything else, that defined the generations who lived through these decades. The clothes changed, the music changed, the tactics changed, but the loyalty, the pride, and the sense of belonging stayed exactly the same. That code would become the final piece of the story, the thread that connected mods, skinheads, and casuals into one continuous history. Chapter 4. The Code: Loyalty, Reputation, and Legacy. By the time the 1980s began to draw to a close, it was clear that football culture in Britain had travelled a long road. The clothes had changed, the music had changed, and the tactics used by supporters had evolved from open street battles to more organised confrontations. But beneath all those changes, there was something that stayed exactly the same from the earliest mod gatherings to the height of the casual years. That something was the code, the unwritten set of rules that every lad understood, even if nobody ever sat down and explained it to them. It didn't matter whether you were standing on a seaside promenade in the early 1960s, wearing a sharp suit and parka, or packed into a crowded terrace in the mid-1970s, wearing boots and braces, or walking through a city centre in the 1980s, dressed head to toe in sportswear. The expectations were the same. You stayed loyal to your mates, you backed your side, you didn't betray the people you stood with. Those ideas weren't written in books or taught in classrooms. They were learned through experience, through observation, and sometimes through hard lessons that stuck with you for life. Loyalty sat at the centre of everything. Being part of a group meant more than just turning up on match day. It meant being there when things got difficult. It meant travelling together, standing shoulder to shoulder, and knowing that the person next to you would not disappear when trouble started. That kind of trust didn't form overnight. It was built through shared experiences, long train journeys, tense moments outside grounds, late afternoons in crowded pubs, and sometimes nights that ended with bruises, cuts, and stories that would be retold for years afterwards. Reputation was the other pillar that held everything together. In this world, reputation meant everything. It followed you wherever you went. It shaped the way rivals looked at you and the way your own group treated you. A strong reputation could earn respect even from enemies, while a weak one could leave you isolated within your own ranks. Reputation wasn't about winning every confrontation. It was about being seen to stand firm. It was about refusing to back down when your group needed you most. There was also silence, an understanding that what happened among the group stayed within the group. Outsiders didn't need to know details. Names weren't shared freely. Stories were told carefully, often leaving out the parts that mattered most. That silence wasn't just about avoiding trouble with authorities. It was about protecting the group itself. Loyalty meant trust, and trust depended on knowing that your mates wouldn't speak out of turn. Across every generation, from mods to skinheads to casuals, this code created a strong sense of belonging that was difficult to explain to anyone outside the culture. To outsiders, it might have looked like chaos, aggression, or mindless violence. But for those inside it, there was structure, meaning, and identity. The group became an extension of family, especially in working-class communities where opportunities were limited and daily life could feel repetitive and hard. Friendship played a massive role in keeping these cultures alive. Many of the lads who travelled together every weekend also worked together during the week. They grew up on the same streets, attended the same schools, and drank in the same pubs. Football gave them something to rally around, something to defend, and something to take pride in. Even when violence entered the picture, it was often framed not as random aggression, but as defense of identity, defense of territory, reputation, and belonging. Over time, these shared experiences created stories that lasted decades. Stories of narrow escapes, unexpected encounters, and moments when everything could have gone wrong, but somehow didn't. Those stories became legends within groups, retold in pubs long after the events themselves had passed into history. Some were exaggerated, others quietly accurate, but all carried the same message, that belonging to something bigger than yourself mattered. As the years moved on and football itself began to change, the environments that had shaped these generations also changed. Stadiums were modernized, seating replaced terraces, security tightened, policing became more sophisticated. For many older supporters, these changes felt like the end of an era. The world they had known, loud, unpredictable, and raw, began to disappear, replaced by something cleaner, safer, and more controlled. But even as physical spaces changed, the memories remained. Those who lived through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s carried those memories with them long after the terraces were rebuilt and the old routines faded. The friendships forged during those years often lasted lifetimes. The sense of identity built around clubs, towns, and groups never truly faded, even as the culture itself became less visible. Looking back across those decades, it becomes clear that each generation didn't exist in isolation. The mods laid the groundwork by creating group identity and territorial pride. The skinheads hardened that identity into something more physical and confrontational, linking football directly to reputation and status. The casuals refined the tactics, introducing organisation, subtlety, and strategic thinking. Each era built on the last, carrying forward the lessons learned by those who came before. And perhaps the most important thing to understand about these generations is that they were shaped by their time. Britain during those decades was very different from what it is today. Industries dominated working class life. Opportunities were limited. Entertainment was scarce compared to modern standards. Football wasn't just a pastime. It was one of the few outlets available, one of the few places where people could gather, express themselves, and feel part of something meaningful. Even now, decades later, echoes of that culture can still be found. Certain traditions remain. Certain rivalries still carry emotional weight. Certain names still carry reputation, even among younger generations who never experienced the original events firsthand. The legacy of those years didn't disappear. It became part of football's history, woven into the identity of clubs and communities across Britain. For many who lived through those times, the memories are complicated. There is pride, but also reflection. Nostalgia mixed with the understanding that the world has moved on. Some look back with fondness at the friendships and the sense of belonging. Others remember the fear, the injuries, and the consequences that followed. But almost everyone who experienced it understands one simple truth: those years shaped who they became. And when you look back across the decades, from the seaside battles of the 1960s to the organised confrontations of the 1980s, it becomes clear that the real story isn't just about fights or fashion. It's about identity. It's about belonging. It's about young men searching for purpose in a world that didn't always offer clear direction. That is the legacy left behind by the mods, the skinheads, and the casuals. Not just stories of conflict, but stories of brotherhood, loyalty, and survival in a changing world. When you look back now, it's hard to believe how much has changed. The streets feel different. The grounds feel different. Even the sound of football feels different. The roar is still there. The passion is still there. But the world around it isn't what it once was. There was a time when Saturdays meant something more than just 90 minutes of football. Saturdays meant early mornings, meeting up in familiar places, seeing the same faces week after week. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you subscribe, you will be notified when we release a new video. It could be your firm we make a video about next, so don't miss out and hit the subscribe button. You can find me on Facebook or email me if you have a good story to tell. See you next time.